Welcome. Happy Tuesday, everyone. And thank you all so much for joining us for how to talk about job trauma on an interview. And I'm joined here today with a dear friend of mine, a pioneer in the legal ops and legal technology industry, one of the coolest people I know, and somebody who's got a real perspective and a ton of experience when it comes to hiring people, when it comes to interviewing talent. Everyone, please welcome Greg Capel from Kaiser Permanente joining us here today. Say hi, Greg.
Hey, thank you so much, Jared. It is good to be introduced as an OG of the legal operations. I started it in 1998 at PricewaterhouseCoopers before they even called it discovery, much less e-discovery. And today, working with Kaiser Permanente to help transform our legal department across cost, technology, process management, and a lot of that is how we marshal human capital to be the best it can be as a team.
Welcome, Greg. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jared Casalia. I'm the CEO and founder of True Staffing Partners. True specializes in data privacy, e-discovery, and cybersecurity staffing and career management. We place hundreds and hundreds of people a year in the space. We work with the MLA 200, the Fortune 1000, private equity venture capital-backed companies, startups, software companies, and everything in between. And we have hundreds of interviews that happen every month. And we've just found ourselves at this moment in time. And Greg, that's what we're here to talk about, is this moment in time where we just spent the last 24 months in one of the most frenzy-like periods of hiring and job mobility in the history of America, much less the history of legal technology broadly as a community, or even just legal or technology as separate broad communities. And we find ourselves in this place where Facebook is announcing a few more thousand layoffs coming this week, and really initiated what has become sort of a roll tide for my Alabamians of layoffs. So we're here to talk about job trauma. Greg, help define for us what job trauma means and what we're talking about here today specifically.
Sure. Well, really when we talk about trauma, it's anything that knocks us off of being our authentic self. Something that either physically, emotionally, maybe even spiritually kind of takes us off the track of who we were or what we're doing and puts us into a fight, flight, or fright kind of survival mode.
And we're talking specifically here, I think, today about people who've been laid off and the job trauma that comes with being laid off. And I know that we want to take it from the perspective not only of the job seeker, but also the hiring manager who, in a down economy or a preparation for a down economy or a pre-recession economy or whatever we're calling this, what feels a little bit like an extended state of limbo in the marketplace. The job market report for January showed 500,000 new jobs, and yet there are still lots of people getting laid off and lots of employers complaining about the difficulty finding workers, whether it's in our industry or other industries. And yet here are people who are out of work, some of them for the first time in their lives being laid off. Let's talk a little bit about why these people are being laid off right now and how that relates to the kind of trauma they're having. Yeah. What's your perspective on this, Greg? Why are people being laid off in such large volumes right now?
It's such an interesting dynamic because I think what we see and feel today is so different than what we saw and felt in 2009, 2010, right? That was probably job trauma at its height, where people really were kind of put out of work and really not only unexpected or left without other options of what they were going to go to. And I think, a lot of the generation that might be experiencing this today experienced the trying to come out of college and get a job. So there was kind of that first trauma of, can I actually get a job? Now it's welcome to the trauma of, can I keep the job? And one of the things we've actually found over time at Kaiser Permanente and working with labor and employment lawyers is they say that the real peak of lawsuits about employment happens before a recession, because that's when you're still individual and unique in the circumstances of losing your job. They say, and we've actually seen it in the trend of our litigation, that once a recession happens, the lawsuits dropped dramatically because these layoffs are no longer individualized, right? They are really done in mass, kind of indiscriminately, regardless of maybe performance. It has to do with companies and executives that are making decisions to say, we need to somehow protect our bottom line. So we're going to get rid of an entire business unit, regardless of maybe how it's performing. And that's just a whole different scenario. And I think for a generation that has experienced the last 12 years of, even when the pandemic hit, the economy kept going hot, it really changes the dynamic of what does it mean to be laid off and be without a job right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. And we're seeing that in our business as well. The big difference being that, unemployment is really low. And yet job demand specifically in our field is still very high. And so even though people have been displaced, there's not necessarily this sense that there isn't opportunity out there for them. They know that there is. They know the value of their skills. And I want to play this out for our viewers a little bit, Greg, in terms of, we always talk about fright, flight, or fight, right? But there's a fourth F that you and I have been talking about as it relates to how trauma might impact and change the perspective of a job seeker if they've been laid off, not because of performance, but because their company needed to create profitability. And if their company needed to create profitability, they're probably not an employer that's living paycheck, or employee that's living paycheck to paycheck. So they can be a little picky, they can be a little choosy, they can have stronger opinions and feel a little more empowered in going into a very competitive job market, despite the fact that they've been laid off.
And so that's talking about fright, fight, flee, or maybe being free, right?
Being free, baby. Being free. Has the layoffs and actually created kind of a reciprocal of trauma, where actually it has empowered the job seeker who's out of work to have stronger core values about what they're looking for in an employer and in a next opportunity? And how is that creating dissonance with a lot of hiring managers who are expecting to go to a pre-recessionary market and get a bargain or get a discount?
I think a lot of people these days are more familiar with some of the things that Alan Greenspan's book, The Map and the Territory, highlighted, and that is creative destruction. Things are always going to start and then kind of be changed. And the environment and the ecosystem thrives on creative destruction, because when something is destroyed, it opens up new opportunities that you may not have been willing to take the risk on before, when you were in kind of an existing position, right? And so now there's just more of a sense that just because my job has changed doesn't really impact necessarily me or my value. In fact, this is the chance for me to go do what I want to do. And I think it's part of that generational shift as well, Jared. We're talking about a difference between baby boomers and Gen X's, with now a larger population of millennials and Gen Z's out there. And again, looking at historical economics, 80% of the Dow 400 companies were all started within a year after a recession. So it kind of shows you evidence that some of the best things actually get started during some of the most difficult and worst times. And I think, a lot of people that aren't in that paycheck to paycheck scenario are like, wow, finally I get an excuse to decide really what I want to do or go pursue something. And you can see that in the fact that not everybody measures their success anymore by the paycheck, but by the quality of work they're doing, the quality of the teams or the culture they're with. And, as a result, I think people are less apt to make quick decisions out of a feeling of desperation. They are finding that the freedom is as much there as the fleedom.
I would agree with you. And I would also say that in terms of those core values, you have to now incorporate a post-pandemic culture into what some of those value propositions are as both employer and employee. One of the core ones being working from home or work from home flexibility versus in-office mandates. Another one being also whether or not they're going to explore things in a full-time job or in a contract capacity. And so we're getting to this conversation of the job seeker who's out of work doesn't necessarily fall into the same sort of stereotypes that maybe hiring managers, who are the same hiring managers now as were in the last recession, are expecting from the job seeker. So let's define some of those misconceptions, right? Because I see this happening every day.
Yeah.
It's a real problem. And what it leads to is candidates, even out of work candidates, declining offers, sometimes declining offers that are more money than what they were making in the position they were laid off from and ripped from, for a variety of reasons. So let's talk about what are those misconceptions. I know one of the big ones that you and I spent a lot of time talking about is this idea that because someone is out of work, they're going to be willing to compromise on everything, but certainly the financials in terms of compensation, how much they'd be willing to come into an office versus being gainfully employed and looking for work. What are you finding as you're talking to candidates and interviewing them for positions? Are people steadfast on these things? Are hiring managers expecting more flexibility? Out there, like, tell us what you're seeing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting in the fact that I think especially candidates who maybe have gone through a layoff and are having that feeling of freedom are saying, you know what, I'm not going to go back to a place that's going to be like that. Right? I'm not going to go back to a place that's going to put me in a circumstance in another 2 or 3 years where I'm going to be subject to it. I'm going to kind of stand in my own sovereignty and do what I want to do. And it's interesting because even with the experience I've had with some of our recent hires at Kaiser Permanente, even when they've come in, if they've come in and they've judged that the environment isn't what they thought it was going to be, they don't have a problem turning around and leaving in 3 months. The previous psychology would be, well, you at least need to stick around for a year, right? Because job hirers don't want to see that you're moving around between jobs very quickly. And the fact is, I think people just are less concerned about what it is that the perspective is of their resume or the perspective is of their boss, and more about, look, I want to have this kind of lifestyle, right? I've run into so many rock climbers in the last couple months, it's ridiculous. And some of these people are like, well, yeah, I'd like to work, but I'd like to do it 4 days a week on Tuesday through Saturday because I like to climb on Mondays, And I think just using that as a bit of a cliche is that people are starting to prioritize other aspects of the work more than just the work and the pay. And so I think what you're seeing with some of those people who are maybe even declining richer compensated jobs is, I'm not sure if this is the job I want to do. I'm not sure if this is the company I want to do it with. If I have to make a trade-off in some way that really goes against my core values, and I want to be able to have the flexibility of working at home and not do a 2-hour commute through traffic, then you know what? And by the way, a lot of them are adding up on their spreadsheet that the cost of gas, amortization of the car, and tolls actually has an impact on that compensation. I think those kinds of calculations weren't normally done, maybe 10 years ago.
That's right. And we're even seeing candidates, out of work candidates, do the math on those and say, this is what it's going to need to be on top of what I was already making before in a work from home position in order for me to really commute in, because otherwise we're talking about, a 15 to 20% pay cut, particularly in Manhattan. I mean, if you've got a car, you're driving in, you're parking, it can be up to $100 a day to get in and out of the city.
Yeah. We actually, just on that point, Jared, we found the pandemic was incredibly helpful at Kaiser for being able to hire and retain some of our administrative and operational personnel, because Oakland was losing parking spots. And the cost of paying for a parking spot was starting to make it prohibitive for the cost of the compensation that we had for some of those roles.
Fascinating. I want to come back to some of the other things that are misconceptions. And one of them is the job description for employers, and what you and I called the Superman job description, what I like to call the catch-all job description, right? That there's a lot of hiring managers creating job descriptions where they're asking for everything. Even though they may not be expecting to get it all, they're putting it all out there. And as you and I have sort of discussed, this is a misconception, right? I think hiring managers think that job seekers see that and they see, oh, well, like I do some of that, and so I should apply for this. But actually what they're seeing is, I can't do all of that. How can one person do all of that? Or I don't have all of those skills, so I'm not going to apply. I want to share 2 statistics with everybody. One of which is, if you have a work from home position 100%, your jobs, at least through my organization, get filled in under 30 days. And on an average, if you make someone come into an office 4 or more days in an office, it takes 3 to 4 times as long to get a candidate to accept a position, and they have twice as many declines for that reason at the end of the process, even though they've been transparent about wanting that from the beginning, candidates don't want to come into an office, particularly in these industries. And so you are working an uphill battle in terms of time and competition if you want people to come in. And the reason those jobs are staying open longer is because they're having to start their processes over every 30 days when the candidates that they get a bite on take other offers that have more work from home flexibility.
I think this is a real challenge, especially in the legal industry, Jared, because lawyers are about the written word and they're about precision and about reducing all risk. And so when it comes to writing the job description, you're seeing, the first time ever legal operations position at a group being written at the vice president level, right? And I've actually run into colleagues of mine that have said, I'm not happy in the job I'm at, but I look at the job that's being posted and it's just so overwritten ridiculous. I don't want to go there and try to live up to that expectation. So how much is being lost on just even the potential candidate pool because of writing the job description overly ambitious, as opposed to writing the job description a bit more practically and then getting into the process of co-creating what the ultimate outcome is going to be.
I'll also share with you another statistic that jobs filled by postings has decreased, according to LinkedIn, by almost 50% in the last 3 months. So job seekers are not responding to postings, and postings are not getting jobs filled the same way they were 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So there's a dissonance here with the job postings. Hey, Mary Taylor, throw up our first recap slide, just so that everyone at home can take a look here at some of the myths. And these are just, a quick way for us to codify what we're talking about here. First myth being out of work job seekers are going to make compromises for employment, whether it's work from home, whether it's money. Most of them are going to stay pretty strong to what they're looking for and where they were at, and are calculating commuting and travel into the cost of employment. By asking for everything, you'll get everything is a bit of a myth, right? By asking for everything, what we're seeing is you're actually kind of getting nothing. Job seekers will cater to your process and timeline. Entirely untrue. Job seekers still in this industry have an average of 3 jobs at the time that they switch jobs, but a minimum of 2. So they've got options, particularly in data privacy, discovery, and cybersecurity. And finally, the job seekers want full-time work and long-term career assurance. We didn't really touch on this, Greg. Mary Taylor, you can drop the slide. But we didn't really touch on this, Greg, but this is one of the most fascinating myths to me because using the example that you gave earlier about somebody that came in and their expectations were somewhat disaligned and they wound up leaving in a very truncated period of time. We've really found with our customers the best solution to that is contract and contract to hire. And I think the myth that employers have, a lot of them are generationally on the top end, baby boomers and Gen X, and I'm a Gen Xer. I don't have this perspective, but a lot of peers of mine do, which is people don't want contracts. By offering someone a contract, you're saying there's no stability here. People want the guarantee of a full-time position. And the reality is that close to 40% of Americans are working in a gig economy right now.
Yeah.
And that 3 out of every 4 jobs that my organization has filled in the last 60 days has been a contract to hire position, not a full-time position. Yeah. And this is a great thing for both the talent and the hiring managers to understand is a very viable channel where both people can test and set and recalibrate expectations before committing to a full-time position.
I think, the generations, even my generation in today's generation, are looking for flexibility and agility. So this has an impact on both speed of the process and how much they're going to cater to the process, and also what they're going to choose to do. And so, you're a traditional bureaucratic organization who's going to take 3 to 4 months to decide on something. Candidates are like, I'm happy to get in and try and buy something faster than that. So they're not even going to wait for your first month to go by because they're interested in, I'd just rather get in and try it out for 2 months and decide that it's for me or it's not for me. And I think, that's kind of a concept of real options theory. It's about getting more information and making decisions at other strike times. And, in the past, this might have been done through outsourcing or kind of more kind of permanent staffing type agencies. But I think that, as you point out, it's becoming more and more available because of the gig economy to just say, well, look, we want to start with a 3-month contract, a 6-month contract, consider it a paid for interview process, right? I mean, we usually spend a couple years courting our life partners, and then we think we're going to get it done in 30 days or 3 months. And, taking 3 to 4 months to make that decision that you hope is going to last 10 years or something.
Yeah.
It's just not what the culture and the market opportunity is anymore.
Agreed. Let's flip the script. We've got about 10 minutes left. I want to give our job seekers who are out of work some real clear guidance on how to talk about the trauma of being let go on an interview. And the first thing that we both agreed on is obviously you've got to be honest about it, and you've got to be really clear about it. And this is advice and guidance not just for speaking on an interview, but also the written document, right? People still want resumes. People still look at people's LinkedIn profiles. And if you've been riffed, you need to change it from 2001 to present to 2001 to 2003 of January. That finiteness might seem like a minor detail, but the reason why it's so important for out of work job seekers is a lot of them forget it. We probably ask people to fix this 1 out of every 2 resumes that we get from somebody who's been riffed. And the problem is, if you're not working with an agency who catches that and asks you to correct it and change it and put an end stop on your employment, and you send it out and you're on an interview and they say, oh, well, you're still there because your resume says present on it. And you go, oh, no, I was let go. And then you start unpacking all of it. What it actually causes for the hiring manager is now a doubt on your credibility or on your attention to detail, right? Oh, you didn't think it was important enough to change that detail, or are you trying to hide the fact that you're no longer employed? And maybe it was just an innocent mistake that you didn't change it, but now you've got the hiring manager thinking about you in a way that doesn't benefit you. So it's important to put that stop date on there. And Greg, we also talked about this, and I want to hear your comment, identifying the trauma and addressing it and thinking about it head on. Tell us a little bit about that.
I think this is a little bit of the therapy you as a candidate can help yourself through, right? It's not about denying that it didn't happen to you or trying to make it into something that it really isn't. It's about kind of being able to sit into the real feeling of it and be authentic about it. So if you have been, laid off, then just be upfront and honest about it. This is the scenario. In fact, one of the most interesting ones I've seen on LinkedIn recently from one of my contacts was a post about how much they were loving their job and succeeding at it. And then a week later, oh, wow, I just got laid off, even though I got a great performance assessment. Okay. So, at the end, he said, welcome to my next great adventure. It's like, well, I don't know if you were really wanting to welcome your next great adventure. You were loving your job. You were performing well at it. Let's just be honest and upfront about, look, this is the scenario that happened. I'm performing well. I enjoyed doing it. The company made a strategic decision and I was caught up in it. Okay. Maybe not exactly what I wanted to have, but I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity now because there's maybe something else out there that I want to now be able to do. And guess what? You get the opportunity to take advantage of a performer like me that previously would have been locked up in a market somewhere. So it's about being authentic to yourself, not either trying to avoid the issue or try to over embellish the issue.
Let's talk about the over embellishment, because that's our next piece of guidance here, right? There is sometimes an instinct to overcompensate because you feel so wronged or it was such a surprise. So sometimes candidates will come to us and it's very heartfelt with copies of their performance reviews that go back a decade, or letters of recommendation from all of the people who have been mentors for them because they've never been laid off before and they can't imagine what they did that makes them responsible. And sometimes that sense of overcompensation can be unattractive to hiring managers, as if there's something wrong there that you're trying to hide by, showing me all these data points that are beyond a resume and a strong interview and strong articulation of thought on that interview and on your resume, with all this additional kind of stuff to kind of make the scales balance from what your perception is of you are of less value because you were riffed.
Yeah.
And so if a hiring manager comes into the process and doesn't approach it looking for a deal, doesn't come in expecting compromise, doesn't come in looking to take advantage of the situation, the candidate too also should have that same level of confidence of their worth and their value.
Yeah. And, like any good sales process, it's less about focusing on you and more about learning what it is that the client needs, right? So it's about asking questions and exploring it. For me, a lot of my hiring, whether the market's up or down, is I'm hiring for character. I want the quality character traits that I know are going to fit well culturally with my team, that are going to be able to build and grow. Coming at me with too much information about who you are and why you're good and why we should ignore the issue kind of immediately sets off a red flag about, well, are you going to be able to actually integrate with the team? Are you going to be able to understand what we need and tailor what it is that you bring to fit well with us to help make our organization better, whether that be on a try and buy basis? Because, for instance, the example I gave earlier with the candidate who left in 3 months, well, you know what? Those 3 months were kind of valuable still for us. They came in, they delivered some like immediate feet on the street help for us. And it's not like we were just completely investing in them for 3 months and then didn't get anything from it. So it's a lot about being able to focus on the authenticity of being there with your hirer and your candidate and making something together rather than pulling on the past. And that is the definition of trauma, is using past experience for current situation. And what you have to realize is whatever that past experience was, yeah, that's part of what informed you, but don't let that dominate what your current experience is going forward.
Mary Taylor, will you throw up our guidance for job seekers real quick, just to do a quick recap for everybody? We don't want to avoid the conversation in person or on the resume, identifying the trauma, don't overcompensate. And this last one, Greg, I want to talk about quickly, because then we're going to go right into our next slide. We've only got 4 more minutes, and I want to give us some additional guidance on how to leverage value in order to align values. But, I think we have to be careful, just as we say, don't overcompensate in terms of showing too much of why you got laid off, was not your fault. Also, don't overcompensate or don't over-empower yourself to be non-negotiable in totality, right?
Yeah.
A lot of times that can also, like, I want what I want, I'm looking for what I want, and I expect everybody to bend to my will. Know your trade-offs, right? Know what you're willing to negotiate.
No, they call it the BATNA in negotiation, your best alternative to a negotiated agreement, right? And so you got to understand what is really important for you and what's a trade-off, right? If staying where you're at and not relocating is important, if not commuting is important, if the salary is important, well, you're not going to be able to get everything, right? And so you got to know where you're going to create those trade-offs in order to have a co-created conversation with your hiring organization.
And you got to know before you go in, because you got to have the poker face. They'll read it on your face if you don't know what you're willing to trade off, and if you're unwilling to trade off.
Yeah, we don't want to be over pleasers, right? We want to know what we want, but be willing to create a trade-off, because in the end, you're creating a working relationship through the process of the interview.
So we've kind of touched on this first one, which is, check the fit before you commit. It goes both ways. And the job seekers are as willing to do it as maybe more willing than employers in some instances. But I want to talk about this second one, separating career discussion from job discussion, because I think it happens a lot where people go on an interview and they're interviewing for being there for 10 years as opposed to what the impact opportunity is with the job. And that's, separating the values that translate instantaneously versus some of those values that are more what we would call investment or career values, as opposed to job impact values, and knowing how to separate those in conversation as both hiring manager and as job seeker. And then, Greg, I'm going to kick this last one to you, which is close to my heart too. Selling on extremes versus selling on authenticity. Tell our listeners what we mean when we say that.
Yeah, well, ultimately, when you're looking to hire, if you make the organization look like it's going to be saintly, you're going to set expectations that when you bring that new hire in, they're going to find out the reality, and then they're going to maybe be quick to leave. And, so being real about what the organization really is, I think, is important to the current generation, especially ones who have had a layoff. This is not about the time to try to take advantage of or exploit people. It's the time to find some value in who is out there that you may not have been able to access before. In the previously tight market where people were tied up, you might not have gotten what you wanted. By trying to take advantage of people right now, by saying this is the beautiful Mecca, you might still not get what you really want. And, so ultimately hiring for your culture is probably the most important thing. And that means as an employer, knowing where there's some trade-offs are. I mean, a small increase in the salary you're willing to pay could engender incredible loyalty and value from the candidate you're getting, as opposed to the 3-page requirement job description that you're hoping they're going to be perfect on. And then, listen, we all can get on stage and we can make it seem like we're something we're not. And as an employer, you don't want to be encouraging the candidates to fake it till they make it, right? You really want to be able to judge who they really are and create a connection that's going to be good for each other. And I think, as I've seen some of the questions about the job interview process, this is kind of the hardest thing. It is about the fact that you are getting into a relationship. If either side is trying to fake each other out and try to be the one who's in control of the power, then you're probably going to get a misaligned result. And that means you're going to have to be a little open to some vulnerability, both as a hiring manager and as a candidate. And that can be the hardest thing when you're coming out of job trauma, is being vulnerable, because you've had your heart broken once. You don't want it broken again. But you know what? It's always better to find out in a couple of days of the interview process than it is a couple months or a couple years later, when maybe you're hoping the layoff's going to come because you made the wrong decision or you hired the wrong person.
I also think the selling extremes goes in the other direction too. And this is where I've seen employers really hurt themselves in attracting talent, which is it's a little bit of an old school mentality of, well, I'm going to make it seem like it's worse than it really is here, to really see on the interview process if the candidate has a thick enough skin or is prepared to walk on coals, even though it's not really going to be like that. And what we're seeing in today's post-pandemic job seeker marketplaces, they're not interested in that. I mean, we've had a lot of candidates reject opportunities because the expectations were set to be hyperbolically negative in order to test their fortitude as part of the interview process. And it's getting negative results, right? It's scary.
Even more reason to consider the contract to hire. As a candidate, maybe you should be bold enough to suggest it and not wait for the employer. I found, actually, when I interviewed for my job at Kaiser 9 years ago, I hit my 9-year anniversary on Friday. They had posted one title and one description, and through the process, I really co-created what the right expectation was. And that takes a little bit of courage on my part as a candidate, but I think it also demonstrates who I was as a candidate and creates more value as I'm co-creating it with the employer.
So Greg, we're out of time, but I want to spend, if you'll hang with us for 3 minutes and answer a couple of really thoughtful questions we got from our listeners. The first is, how do you as a job seeker negotiate from a position of power when you are out of work?
So listen, power is all about yourself. And this goes to the heart of trauma and authenticity. I mean, know who you are and know what you want, and know where those trade-offs are, because everything can't be completely uncompromising. But if you know that, then you're in a position of power. You're not here to please other people. You're here to find the right fit for you and the right fit for them. And if you kind of get too much into that, oh, I need something now, and am I doing something to satisfy your question? That's how you're giving your power away, right? And you ultimately want to be able to keep your own power within yourself as being true to, this is who I am and this is what I want. And that means sometimes taking a risk and answering the question in a way that may not be what you think they're asking for. The 4 Agreements by Miguel Ruiz says, don't make assumptions. Maybe when you answer the question that way, you find out that wasn't what they were hoping to hear anyway. And you go down a whole new route and you find options to create this job that you'd never expected when you were either trying to be too powerful or too pleasing. You're really trying to find that comfortable Goldilocks balance.
I also think, if this question is specifically about compensation, it's all about setting expectations before you arrive on the interview. I think it's really important, particularly if you're not represented by an agent like my organization. The benefit of an agency, one of the many benefits of an agency, is that they're setting very clear salary, how many days in an office, all of those kinds of things that are kind of core to these decisions before we get into culture and values and the more ethereal part of job seeking. The ability to set clear expectations from the get-go, not once you've shown up for the interview, but before that, is critical to establishing a position of power with which to negotiate from. right?
Yeah, it's basics of negotiation is you kind of set your platform and you signal before you get into it. If it's not even the right opportunity, then just don't even get into it.
So I've got another question here. What are some good questions to prepare to suss out a potential employer's values and culture?
Hmm. I think a lot of asking about some previous experiences, who were the last people you hired that worked out well? Who were the people that you hired that didn't work out well? You want to actually interview the employer in the same way that they're interviewing you. So you hear a lot about situational interview questions, right? As a candidate. Well, the same is true. Can you tell me about a situation that went bad? Can you tell me about a situation that was successful? Can you tell me what your current strategic plan is or what your objectives are? Not just for me as a candidate, but for the team I'm going to be joining. You know, could I speak to one of your other employees? Often employers are asking candidates for references. This is great that I'm having a chance to meet with you, the hiring manager. Am I going to meet with other people? Right? Because if you can start to meet with different people, you can start to triangulate what is the truth of the culture and not just the perspective of one interviewer.
So I want to echo what you said, Greg. It's so important that on interviews, both hiring managers and job seekers, we're talking about what we've done, not what we know. We don't want to hear about what you know. We want to hear about what you've done. You've got to keep it in the practical, not the hypothetical. And then I'll also say this. I think a great question for hiring managers is, can you describe for me in like one or two words only, three core values of the organization with like in adjectives or verbs, and then unpack for me why you pick those adjectives or verbs? Because when you give something an adjective or a verb and then you have to describe it simplifies things, right? Culture should be that simple, right? At True
Mhm.
Staffing Partners, growth is one of our adjectives, verbs, right? We're all about growth here, growth for our candidates who we represent, growth for the companies that we represent, growth for the individuals who join our organization. We could talk all about growth and investing in our talent and all of these things here and have really demonstrative examples of how we've done it over the years and people have grown. Another question that I think is always a great one to ask people that really show their culture and their values is, have you ever had an experience where you've hired somebody who didn't perform as expected? You gave them a performance improvement plan and now they're a shining star. What was it in that performance improvement plan that leveled them up? Because if you can talk to an employer about how they've taken someone who's not meeting expectations and gotten them to meet expectations, you're going to learn for them what level of commitment they're willing to put in their employees and what made an employee who wasn't meeting expectations suddenly successful. And that's a story that any employer would love to tell.
I'm going to keep that one for the future, Jared. All about context, community, and culture right there.
Yes, sir. Well, we are out of time. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Please thank my good friend and a man I admire deeply in a variety of ways, Greg Capel. Thank you for joining us, Greg. Again, my name is
Good to be here with you.
And Greg, I'll let you have the final word to all of our listeners.
I think it's just great to be here talking about a topic that is becoming more prevalent in our society, and that is trauma, whether it be the personal, emotional trauma that you might suffer as you're growing up or in a car accident, or what we see as being professional trauma. I started my career in technology because I thought that would solve it. And I realized we needed process in order to do technology. But then I realized in order to do process, we need to have an organization. What I finally realized is you can't even get the right organization if individuals are traumatized. So, being upfront about that and being able to heal yourself and heal the people you're hiring are going to be what creates the best kind of team to be a professional athlete. And I would just say it's always great as a professional athlete to take advantage of an agent for life. And True Staff is definitely one of those groups that I would recommend and rely on to help you in your career.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Share with your friends and join us next time. Thank you.
Take care.